Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the War Report. We're recording right after some breaking domestic news in the United States. That, of course, is the result of the Derek Chauvin trial. Now, of course, he is the police officer involved in a certain incident in Minneapolis last May that we will not mention by name because, again, I value this platform and I know there's certain lines I cannot cross. But he was funny enough, the secondary point of all that. Now, the person who died was of course, main focus of all this has gained almost a messianic status in the modern liberal empire, which, again, we've gone over. You can go back last summer, did several episodes on it. Well, the verdict came down today, and he was found guilty. Now, keep in mind, this is after the New York Times and several other mainstream media outlets started posting, oh, what we know about the jurors for this trial, and putting out a bunch of information where you put the pieces together, you have their name, you have their address, you have their place of employment, you have pretty much everything you need to ruin somebody's life. So, was it a fair trial? Of course, I would never. It was about as fair as this most recent election. With that being said, of course, one of the most secure processes in American history. Nothing went wrong. It was all great. It was, well, that's not great on the computer. Oh well, I think we can get past that. No problem there. But again, it was all great. It was all fine. And justice has been delivered, and our new messianic figure can now rest in peace while we build many more shrines to him with his golden casket, all that good stuff. Now, we are only a couple hours, like an hour and a half actually, out from when this was brought down. So we'll see what ensuing reaction there is to this. I People have said, and I tend to agree, there will probably be rioting and demonstrations regardless of the outcome, just because of that, and not to mention the rash of other supposed racially charged incidents that just keep on cropping up day after day, getting unreasonable amount of media press, things that happen all the time, police misconduct, which, in some cases, admittedly, like, yeah, they shouldn't have done that, but of course they turn it into a national media story. And now, one can say with Biden in office, you in fact had Biden making statements. You had the Congresswoman from California, I believe it was Maxine Waters, coming out there and making statements about this, and a bunch of high profile politicians. And I remember when Trump was talking about, I think it was a trial for some terrorist, and said, well, he should be given the death penalty. People talked about how that was an overextension of his role as president, and of course, again, hypocrisy is one of the lowest arguments, but Biden, Waters, none of these other people get held to the same standard when it comes to that, showing who the real people in power are, with that being said. But it looks like they have pulled off their greatest color revolution operation yet. Now, of course, that did happen back in November, removing the evil Dotard Blump from office. But it looks like they have brought this to a full circle and that they have really solidified it. They have taken care of the initial incident for this. They have put this guy behind bars, and I'm pretty sure he's. I don't think he's ever getting out. And that's assuming he doesn't get killed in a prison fight or something, with the way a lot of ex cops in prison end up, especially him. We'll see how that goes, but I do not think Derek Chauvin is long for this world at this point. But it's good news, guys, because Biden and Amazon and Kamala Harris and George Soros, they all banded together and defeated white supremacy so we can live in a much safer, more secure country that values women and diversity. And I'm frankly very proud to be an American right now on this day. But in other news, we have to contrast that with the horrible, horrible failed revolution in Belarus and how Lukashenko is still holding on to power, and how apparently Russian intelligence thwarted a plot that was allegedly going to lead to him and several of his family members' assassination on May 9th. And I believe May 9th is the day that they do the Victory Day parades in most of the former Soviet Union, correct?
Yes, that's their Victory Day parade. Sometimes people mistakenly think that May 1st is like a really big deal. I remember my first visit to Russia, discovering that May 1st was really not that big a deal. However, in the evenings leading up to May 9th, at least a week or two before, they'll have rehearsals. So you'll see all the new tanks. You'll see some old ones too. You'll see armored personnel carrier. You'll see like intercontinental ballistic missile carriers, which I hope they're not the missiles aren't armed people. So it's it's wild. So I mean, yes, they rehearse for the parade, and the parades there are very different than the parades in the West. So that's what I'll say. So it's a very significant day, both for Russia and for Belarus. People might think that maybe this story is suspect because they caught them in Moscow, but the truth is, um, they would have been caught much sooner had they gone into Russia from Belarus or from an EU country.
Oh no, I don't think people understand how much more repressive the Belarusian state security is compared to the Russian one. And I'm not necessarily saying that's a bad thing. It looks like it's worked out quite well for them, especially in this most recent incident. But again, people still think of Russia. They still think the Chekas on the streets and that it's 1919.
Yeah,
Whereas Russian, again, Russia does have a very repressive security state, but it's not even compared to what the KGB was in, say, the 1980s. And seeing as there's much more ties between America and Russia, even with how strained relations are, we've never really had proper ties with Belarus. It makes sense that we wouldn't have agents operating directly within the country, and again, trying to infiltrate them from the European Union. There's no path then. It makes sense why, and I don't know if this is the exact case, but just for example, why these sort of things, why American interference in Belarus would be planned out of the embassy in Moscow. I think we just recently opened our Belarusian embassy under Pompeo. That was in 2019, late 2019, after the wonderful oil and gas deal they signed. That definitely wasn't a possible death warrant for Lukashenko, and it would have been had this plot succeeded. But I can absolutely believe it because, again, Lukashenko, he isn't the best leader in the world, especially from the Russian perspective. The Russians have their great deal of frustration with him, going back again to that oil deal, into his half-hearted cooperation with them and his constant threatening to stab them in the back. But it looks like what has come of this is, as I said, Lukashenko made a lot of enemies. He made a lot of enemies within the CIA. He made an enemy, I believe it was the International Monetary Fund, when he refused to accept the aid in exchange for doing a nationwide lockdown. Enemies of the
yeah.
European Union. And just, again, enemy of the liberal world order in general. I don't and again, you can pull up that old meme about like, all these countries don't have the central banks, and they're the targets of. They don't have the central banks owned by the Rothschilds or some other banker family, and they're the targets of color revolutions, which is true. Say Iran, Syria, Iraq under Saddam. A lot of it does come back down to the power of international finance, and especially in the case of the IMF, definitely in Belarus. But again, to make a long story short, Lukashenko had a lot of enemies on all sides. The Russians were willing to tolerate him because, again, Belarusian liberals and the other alternatives that could take power were much worse. Granted, I think their final goal, and we may see this in the near future, was the reintegration of Belarus into Russia proper. But I could definitely see this after they've exhausted all their routes. After they, again, every color revolution, I would say, since the failure of Syria has pretty much gotten egg on the face of the State Department of the CIA. Ukraine turned into a basket case, which I don't think was entirely the goal. I think they wanted a semi-stable state out of it. Syria, Assad isn't still in power. Libya, again, is also a basket case. North Africa, Egypt is constantly on the brink of some sort of Islamic takeover and just internal tension in general, rise in terrorism there. Point being is, I think they wanted a victory after a decade of defeats, and they thought offing Lukashenko on, again, Victory Day of all days would have been the right move.
Right. And just to clarify, like if you were a non-Russian or a non-Belarusian civilian, you have to, if you're going to Belarus, you're going to have to go in exactly the same way you came out. So you would go to Minsk. The paperwork to do it otherwise is extensive, and there's no guarantee. So it's more complicated than that. And so I'm now, of course, if you are a citizen, right, and you land in Moscow or St. Petersburg and you want to go to Belarus, you'll notice in the airports that for every non-citizen of Belarus or Russia, you go into these other queues, and that might be broken down further by EU or not. And then for everyone else, they go to a queue that's both Russian and Belarusian. And it's been that way for several years, for many years. It was there that way the first time I went there and the last time. So I'm guessing for them, they thought it would be easier to go into Moscow first and from there go into Belarus instead of from a Western country or any other country other than Russia. That's basically that was their approach. But what was interesting is that literally an hour after this news came out, we heard about those two incredible FSB agents might have been or definitely are behind an explosion that took place in October 2014. Now, what they omit from the official story, of course, is that in December there was another explosion at this munitions site in eastern Czech Republic. So they don't tell you that, right? And that's obvious because the story goes that the day of the explosion is also the day that these two scoundrels left. And these are the same guys, Petrov, and the other guy starts with a B. It's not Borisov, it's something else, that are implicated in the Skripal assassination attempt in Salisbury in the UK.
Let me guess, they're also behind poisoning Navalny's underwear.
Right. So, and of course, they got access by an email where they sent photocopies of their passports. Like, I mean, who would, what kind of an intelligence agency would do this? The owner of the depot is some Bulgarian guy. And then there were claims from video footage in a parking lot that there was an attempt made on his life, but it affected one of his coworkers or one of his employees, rather. So I think the story is very sketchy. It's also very unsubstantiated, but that didn't stop Czech Republic from expelling 18 diplomats. More are coming. Russia retaliated with an expulsion of 20. But the whole point of this right now, from the larger picture, right, is for America to create a consensus, right? There is a sense of a splintering occurring in the West. And that splintering is even on a domestic level within America. And in order to keep everything whole, Russia has to be made into this great, terrible threat that can undo the whole thing. They not only interfered with the 2016 elections, but even with the 2020. And maybe in 6 months we'll find out that they also interfered with the George Floyd, the Chauvin court case as well. Who knows? Literally anything is possible. The other narrative that has fallen apart, of course, has been the claim that Russians were paying the Taliban to kill American soldiers. Again, unsubstantiated, and now they've walked it back when it doesn't matter. So they did their job. Headline consumers of news are satiated, and it doesn't matter anymore. So so Lukashenko. So there was an attempt made on his life. That might be partly because there is a sense that the way things are developing, especially after the election last year, that a union between Russia and Belarus is probably closer to a reality than it was prior. Even this week, last week, Lukashenko again made overtures that the only solution is for Russia to join with Belarus, and that the majority of Belarusians agree with this. So over 50% agree that this ought to be the case. The countries are already incredibly well integrated, but this would be the next step. And who knows? That could happen. Russians, by and large, don't want it. So it is unique that way. It does seem counterintuitive, but that is the case.
Well, the question is, Russians may be opposed to it, but considering if an alternative is, and I'm not saying this is the case, I think the last color
Mm.
revolution was pretty thoroughly thwarted, having a second Ukraine on the border, I think they would be more open to the alternative. Now, again, I can't say that for certain. I think we might have to get a certain Russian correspondent back on the show sometime soon. I should probably reach out to him, speaking of which. But with that being said, you bring up a good point about the Czech Republic expelling the Russian diplomats. Bulgaria also expelled, I think, two, which, yeah, that really sends a message. Bulgaria is expelling two Russian diplomats. And you said it's to try to rally the West around one banner of opposing Russia. And again, we've talked about this time and time again. The West is a civilization that is fundamentally out of steam. It has nowhere to go culturally. I would say even at this point, increasingly technologically, militarily too. Again, there's really nothing it can aspire to or look forward to or really, again, rally around. So they're trying really hard to astroturf this conflict with Russia, which picked up in a select few Eastern European nations. One may think Poland, the Baltic states, Czech Republic, etc. But even then, you look at some of the opinion pollings out of some place in the Balkans, even some place in Western Europe. You have, as we said a few weeks ago, the AFD calling for the lifting on sanctions on Russia. A lot of these populist parties in Western Europe, you think Lega in Italy or the National Rally in France or any of these various ones, want at least a cessation of hostilities with Russia, if not an outright mending of relations. So it really only picks up steam among American liberals, American neoconservatives, which is a really difference without distinction at this point, and Eastern European nationalists in places like Poland, Ukraine, the Baltic states. So they're really trying to astroturf this. They're trying to build Russia up as what it was during the Soviet Union. It's this internationalist power that wants to subsume us all under this dark totalitarianism. Look at all their spy operations. Look how they interfere in our politics. Look at how they poison their own dissidents and how they even send assassins to poison dissidents in Western countries, which may harm Westerners, etc. And look at poor Navalny sitting in his cell, starving himself to death, just like Gandhi did. That is the new thing they're trying to pull it on. Navalny is on the hunger strike. He is saying, until Putin frees me and Russia is a proper democracy, I refuse to eat. And really,
Yeah, yeah.
this is just sort of a desperate last ditch thing. I mean, what's his prison sentence even? Only like 2 years? Something ridiculous.
He literally has 2.5 years to go. He's in there for fraud. You know, he's not in there because of his conscience. And again, that's another fact that the Western media is happy to omit. Um, Again, he has to remain a spectacle like that. Those are his marching orders, right? I mean, he has been taped with suspected MI6 back going over 6 years ago, and the fact is his daughters attend Stanford University. How did this guy get 30 employees for his YouTube channel? He literally does not make that much money. So of course he is funded. We don't know exact. I mean, there are probably some people that I haven't researched it, but I'm very sure there are some people who or NGOs who would claim to and proudly claim to fund Navalny, but there's no way. He was not born of a wealthy family. His wife doesn't come from a wealthy family. He's astroturfed. He's literally a Guaido. He's just as much a Guaido as Tikhanovskaya from Belarus, who's living in Latvia at the moment. And I mean, even Estonia offered citizenship to Navalny. Well, he's going to have to fill out his, serve his time. Maybe then he can move there. Not sure how enthusiastic both America and Estonia will be once that happens. But the whole point is to keep Russia in the news. The whole point is to have stories that demonize Russia, that make Russia seem severe and archaic and authoritarian. And like the fact is, There's many other countries where he would have faced a much harsher sentence. If he was in China, he would probably get over 20 years minimum. 2.5 years is light. I mean, it was 3.1 or something, but they knocked off a half because they already realized, that half it, he'd already served it in some capacity or another. But this is his latest stunt, and it's basically just to gain attention, right? I don't think Navalny is the kind of man who is literally going to die of starvation. He's not going to do it. He's going to buckle, and I think Putin thinks exactly the same thing.
Yeah, I don't think anyone outside of Western elites and the Western media views him as any sort of serious figure in any sense. Russian nationalists don't like him. Do even Russian liberals like him? Again, I can't think of anyone who really likes him beyond liberal blue checkmark journalists on places like Twitter or other social media sites. And really,
I mean, what
it's
Western liberals are implying is that he's somehow presidential material. It's like he's not. I mean, nobody even in Russia thinks that. I mean, the best he ever did was years ago. He got 2% of the vote in Moscow. Like he's nothing. Um,
yeah,
yeah, sorry, but
his
a pundit
only
on
claims to
YouTube isn't going to
fame.
make it.
Yeah, his only claims to fame are his 2% vote margins, his inflammatory comments about Muslims from a decade ago, and him trying to starve himself and get his underwear poisoned. He doesn't have a very good record. This doesn't exactly shine. Like, there's been other revolutionary figures who have been astroturfed to great success. You may not like Nelson Mandela, but they made him look like a respectable, worthy figure that could become president of a country. They succeed with him. They succeed with a lot of these other people they
Very good
installed in power.
point.
But recently, with people like Guaido, people like Tinovskaya, people like Navalny, these people are just outright clowns. They're scraping the bottom of the barrel. Whereas you say during the Cold War, maybe it's because the stakes were a bit higher, at least from their point of view, they actually had to find people who could respectfully lead a nation. Now, whether that be military dictators like Pinochet or, again, any other people that they prop up, who was the president of Guatemala
Oh,
when they like really
or
came
the
with,
Shah, for that matter.
yeah, yeah, for that matter.
Iran. I'm just
Yeah, like they had to find people who again could face the world stage and look respectable and not what are functionally just wannabe celebrities. I don't even know how to. I think that's honestly a too generous term for them. And all I'm saying is sloppy job, CIA. That's all I'm really getting at the end of the day. Now, of course, between all of this, between Ukraine and the Navalny situation, Biden comes out last week, as we briefly touched on, announced more sanctions and is chastising Russia in the media. And then there was an interesting tweet that was put out the other day. That was from the U.S. Strategic Command official account. And just to get the words verbatim, this was put out 19 hours ago as the recording of the show. Posture statement preview. The spectrum of conflict today is neither linear nor predictable. We must account for the possibility of conflict leading to conditions which could very rapidly drive an adversary to consider using nuclear weapons as their least bad option. Now, one would think with the recent tensions they're talking about Russia, you could also think China, maybe even Iran at this point, or North Korea, etc., any of these nuclear states, or soon to be nuclear states. But I just thought it was an interesting tweet, a very interesting sort of power projection while you look at the realistic position of the U.S., we're officially getting out of Afghanistan. Now, as somebody pointed out, the enlisted troops there, the actual members of the U.S. military, versus the contractors and the mercenaries we have there. The mercenaries outnumber the military proper by 7 to 1, so it's not that much of a withdrawal, but point being, it's an official withdrawal, no less. And you look at the current internal state of the U.S. and what are likely to be riots soon, it seems like a very paper tiger statement to come from U.S. Strategic Command that, oh, we are prepared to respond to a nuclear strike from a foreign adversary while they can barely manage what's left of their empire.
Right, and I will probably compare, in comparison to our last episode, I will probably have to eat my words.
or my hat, and that is that I predicted that America won't leave Afghanistan. I think now there is a distinct possibility, and I made that statement even with countries like Australia and the UK also saying that they would leave Afghanistan. But I think as time goes on, and it's very rapid. It's only been about a week. Um, these signals are becoming clearer and clearer, and in retrospect, you can see that America does want this to happen, right? Now, there has to be a sense of unanimity, and I think the reason why they had to make sure Biden, like this whole process happened under Biden, um, of course, because most of the public has their short-term memory, but the reason for it is that if Trump left, obviously the fallout would be such that the UK or the UK and Australia or whatever other countries that are still left there from NATO, they could not possibly contain the Taliban on their own. And that is, if they leave, that is what will happen. They'll be like that period when the Soviets left, where about the first half of the 90s, there were inter-Mujahideen rivals killing each other until the mid 95, 96, when the Taliban emerged and basically took over. There was still fighting, but they were more or less in charge.
Yeah, because believe it
Something
or
like
not, the
that would
communist
happen.
government without Soviet support actually lasted until '92.
Right, because 92 is also when the Soviet government just couldn't afford to fund them anymore, and it was either 91 or 92. And basically, I've heard arguments, including from the Guardian, that this should be a lesson that the U.S. can still salvage something from this by funding them. That the West can still fund them, but without having soldiers there. Now, America hasn't lost a soldier in a year in Afghanistan. I don't know what the costs have been from other NATO members or other countries that are non-NATO that are participating, I guess, in a goodwill sense with America in Afghanistan. I imagine the numbers are still pretty low.
I mean, it's been
is
just
because
on and off
they've taken.
ceasefires over the past 1 or 2 years under Trump, hasn't it? Because I remember Pompeo was meeting with Taliban leaders in Qatar as like May 2020. So active fighting hasn't really been that much. It's just that they've been on a footing preparing for conflict to reemerge because after all it is Afghanistan. But I mean the Soviets, they were throwing shots. They were again, they were involved in active combat until they weren't. Whereas with it seems like America and the coalition in Afghanistan right now, there's been a bit of a wind down to the point where there's only a few thousand official troops out of these countries, most of them being American, and really, I can't think of any major military operations we've involved ourselves in the past few years. It's definitely not compared to anything from like that stretch through 2010 to 2015, right after Osama got killed, where it was that heavy fighting, probably the most intense years of the war, probably like 2009, 2010, 2011. Again,
Yeah.
back during the Osama raid and all that kind of stuff. But really, since 2014, 2015, it's died down a lot. Now we've sustained casualties since then, but as you said, I don't think we've officially taken a casualty in over a year. Now there could just be some people whose operations were so top secret that of course they're not going to reveal their deaths and it's only known to the Pentagon and like the people who knew those people, etc. But again, barring like cases like that, it seems like again there's been zero American casualties in Afghanistan over the past I think like
Yeah.
2 years.
Right, and again, this is to create the image of Western unity under American leadership, right? Um, Everybody's going to leave. Britain almost like in less than 24 hours also said it would leave. Very soon thereafter, Australia followed suit. So it's if it was only America that left, of course, it would be a terrible image. And if it was one of the supporting countries, it would also be a terrible image. Because in one, America looks like a coward, and two, America looks like it's being abandoned. So, it was very important that this monumentous moment came under a Biden administration and not under a communist celebration by, a big white guy, Bolshevik in the White House named Trump. I'm joking.
No, wait a minute.
I couldn't help that May 1st. What made him choose May 1st? I love it. Maybe anyhow, I'm just going to make another stupid joke. But that's the whole point of it, right? You cannot give any success to him. Like, he cannot be responsible for any good that happened in his time in office. I mean, Biden is his administration is actually thinking of completing the Trump wall, which was nothing like the wall that he proposed during his run up to the election. However, I mean, no one will remember that, right? Like, that's the whole point. The propaganda basically worked. This guy is good. This other guy is bad. It doesn't matter if they both end up doing the same things, or the good guy takes over some of the proposals that the bad guy did. That's not really a contradiction, or it's not a big deal. So
well,
what?
It's all about
right?
rhetoric,
So
isn't
you
it?
have
Because Trump's withdrawal from
it's
Afghanistan would have been...
all about rhetoric.
Yeah, because Trump's withdrawal from
and
Afghanistan...
it's also about like vague moral associations, right? There isn't a strong logic. There's just vague moral associations. Like, well, would you rather have you don't like hypocrites? Would you rather have a racist hypocrite or a non-racist hypocrite? So anyways, that's the way the American propaganda machine works.
Yeah, and just going back to what I was saying, a Trump withdrawal from Afghanistan was a direct refutation of the empire. Trump engaging with Russia is a refutation of the empire. Trump doing a lot of his foreign policy moves were refutations of the empire. Whereas when Biden does it, while it may be a concession, a sign of defeat, it's done from what is at least portrayed as in the interest of the empire. We can't get out of Afghanistan because it's mission accomplished, because we succeeded something. While the reality on the paper is because they realize we cannot sustain this mission anymore and we'd need an out. But again, somebody like Trump would have just outright said that, which again is admitting defeat, admitting weakness, whereas Biden can pull it off, or Biden's regime can pull it off as, well, we did a good job. We didn't accomplish everything we wanted, but it was definitely worth it, guys. Trust us. And again, that goes to similar things such as trade negotiations with China, even again down to the wall and immigration policy, in terms of engagement or confrontation with Russia, North Korea, etc. So pretty much any of these points that, because as we pointed out before, and I think this came mainly from Michael Flynn, who was pretty much railroaded within the first 3 weeks of the Trump administration. The Trump administration had a plan to radically redraw the American empire that involved a lot of scaling down, a lot of cutting off obligations, and really a fortification and retreat. So that, again, was unacceptable to the people at the top. That was unacceptable to the establishment, the neoconservatives, the liberals, whatever you call them. But I think as time went on, they realized as much as we hate this guy, he's kind of right. So when they got their guy in power, they realized, how do we implement these policies without making it look like this is a concession of the empire or key aspects of the empire?
Yeah, I think you're bang on. The only thing I would add is that I think even what you're saying is not the greater subtext, right? Because they had made the case, especially for the faithful, like especially for Dems and liberals, that indeed, if it had not been for Putin, Trump would never have been elected. And so the optics as such would be that whatever Trump does is because Putin is asking him to do it. And if Trump is packing up the empire, well, it's because Putin is telling him to pack up the empire. It's not the conditions on the ground, right? Whatever the weak points may be, America has resolve and reserves that could overcome it. They always have. Why would it be different now? So I would say the subtext was, because right from election night onwards, and even prior, they were complaining that the Russians had hacked even the voting system, according to Maddow. Just ridiculous stories. And then the dossier is actually formulated by someone working for Hillary. He's a British MI6 spy. Like, it's just ridiculous. So I would say that's the reason why. Optically, it was terrible. It would have been extremely demoralizing. The effects will be the same. The outcomes will be the same. If we disregard what I just said, when Biden ends up having to do the same thing. But the impression will be that America has decided to do this, and not America on behalf of Putin.
On behalf of Putler, as it was, as Trump.
Or Putler.
Yes, but I think you make a great point that, again, Trump's, and I intentionally, anything his administration did, or regime, or whatever you want to call it, was tarnished by the fact that it's because he's in league with Russia. That's why this is happening. And again, it all came down to narrative. It all came down to how they can sell this not only to the American public but to the Western public and the world at large. To the point where, again, what Biden does is purely in the interests of the American people, purely in the interests of this country, whereas what Trump does is in the interest of foreign power and money elites and etc. But with all that being said,
right, and white supremacy.
Oh, of course, who could forget white supremacy? And Biden had some strong words, just an aside for, let's just say, he called Nazis the British equivalent for cigarettes while trying to pronounce the word flag. So that happened this week, and
no,
the only thing,
really?
the only thing I can presume is that Biden or somebody on his speechwriting team has been reading a little bit too much Gorky.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I had to shoehorn that joke in somewhere in the show.
That is great. That's a good one.
But yeah, and again, going back to, honestly, I want to quote our press secretary, circle back to Biden and his role as president. I mean, you had Kamala Harris meeting with the Japanese delegation this week, so again, further to the absentee president, where you have Kamala and Blinken, and again, increasingly even the defense secretary, for example, with his trip to Israel, doing all these, at least diplomatic functions of the president, while Biden is nowhere to be seen. But all of a sudden, he has time to come out and comment on this ongoing trial with Chauvin and the police brutality and all that kind of stuff. So he is an absentee as far as that's concerned. He's an absentee as far as diplomacy, but they can send him out there to make those canned statements, which we all know the reason why they do it that way. But I do think it's interesting that, again, Biden has been so sheltered. Where, again, today marks 3 months of him being in office, so 90 days. We're close to that 100-day mark that most people grade the president on. And again, you've rarely seen head or hair of him. Really, the only notable examples I can think of are his first full day in office, the day after he assumed office, was the "Will you give me a break, man?" while he was confronting the press people. This most recent incident where he said the thing about the Nazis, and him coming out to this. I can't think of any major diplomatic things he's had aside from this scuffle with Russia. But really, again, he's been an absentee president. I keep on thinking, trying to be objective, maybe this should just compare it to how much of a media hog both Obama and Trump were. But even comparing somebody like Biden to Bush, and I know Bush's first year in office was presented with a major crisis such as 9/11 and the Afghanistan war. Again, Biden has been a complete absentee compared to even some more reserved presidents in recent history. Because again, you go back, Trump was media hog, Obama was media hog, Clinton was. The Bushes less were, even though you're getting sort of into the territories where you can't compare them because of the difference in how media is disseminated now. But again, just compared to our most recent presidents, it doesn't seem like it doesn't seem like he even exists, does it?
Yeah. He is absentee, and Are you telling me he really said the F word in association with the Nazi flag?
He tried to
Like
say
that was a for real.
flag, but he mispronounced it, and the look of shock on his face when he realized what he has just done. It's a hilarious clip if you guys
Oh,
can find it.
okay.
But
I
no,
haven't
no,
seen it.
he was
I just thought,
he was not out there calling them a word that rhymes with baguette. That's all I'll say. It was a complete
oh,
slip.
I
It was a
see. I
complete
see.
slip of the tongue, and you can tell by the look on his face immediately afterwards, and how quickly he corrected himself that it was. But I just thought that was a hilarious moment, and honestly, I could see him if I don't know, maybe they forget to shoot him up with his CIA super drugs one day. He might go off the rails and say something like that. But you never know when it comes to that. And maybe that's why he's so sheltered and they don't let him because he makes gaffes like that. Not that Biden's ever been a particularly good orator, but now with his, again, seemingly declining mental health, of course, we will not commentate on such things in an official manner because, of course, we respect our medical professionals, our mental health professionals who are only qualified to make those diagnoses. But his seeming mental health, it makes sense why they would not put him out there in the spotlight during all of this. But again, I know I'm treading on old ground, but I just think it's so telling how much of an absentee he is. And really, as Trump was symbolic for the uncertain nature of America and its role in the world and its role as the torchbearer of Western civilization, if you will, I think Biden is a very proper successor to
Yeah.
that in that sort of metastructure because he's just nowhere to be seen. It's as if he doesn't exist. And I think that's very fitting after these past few years. The fact that it's just completely MIA, completely absentee, whatever you want to call it.
Right. Almost an entirely symbolic position, run by a very managerial, as far as character is concerned, empire. So, yeah, it makes kind of sense. People aren't, they don't seem, I mean, at least half the country doesn't seem terribly upset with that. Uh, of course, I mean, it's been a gradual thing. Many people said that after Reagan was elected, that this was the case. Um, I, that kind of television-based president, in many ways, Reagan was, but you could also go back to JFK and so on. But it's steady after Reagan, with the exception of George Bush Sr., certainly with Clinton and Obama.
Yeah, the
So,
idea of the president being more of a figurehead and a celebrity, as I'm not saying the managerial and bureaucratic state wasn't massive from, I would say, World War One onwards, but the fact that it completely solidified control of the empire and could manage every aspect of it, and I think as we're seeing now, could effectively function without that figurehead. I think we're seeing that play out, but I think ever since Reagan came to office, pretty much, and with especially a vice president who was leader of the CIA, who had ties to the Pentagon, all that kind of sort of stuff, came from a old money family, that this system was very self-sustaining for the time being. Now we're seeing cracks in that system. I think we're seeing cracks in that system a lot sooner than a lot of people expected. But point being is, I think again, you make a good point. From Reagan onward, it didn't really matter who the president was beyond rhetorical issues and beyond a few pieces of really irrelevant policy here and there. For example, are we going to slightly raise or slightly lower the corporate tax rate? Are we going to promise all these big social changes that nobody can deliver on, etc.? But I think this is treading old ground that everyone who watches the show probably already knows. But I think it makes a good point that at the end of the day, the American presidency since the 1980s, 1990s has been a purely rhetorical position, a purely symbolic position, and the president wields a lot of power in terms of they can set a narrative. Now, of course, they're an uphill battle with the media, especially with the Trump administration and how that went, but they can, again, sort of become the, for lack of a better term, soul of a nation where, and again, I'm retreading old ground again, whereas Reagan was that nobody's going to mess with America. We're on top of the world. Bush was sort of a continuation that Bush Sr. is. Bill Clinton is we're entering a new century of peace and prosperity. Bush was back to we will weed out any threat to this country, sort of harkening back to a Reagan Bush Sr. sort of policy. Obama again went to that era of hope and change. Trump, of course, make America great again. Again, these things are summed up in the campaign slogans. And getting back to Biden, it's the build back better. and all of a sudden, I guess no hands-on work required from the administration, at least from Biden himself, leaving that to his very interesting cabinet with people like Kamala Harris, people like Blinken. Again, that's going to mainly the people who are responsible for managing the empire's, I would say, external affairs, especially in the case of Blinken. Now, how much role Kamala plays in domestic policy, but again, Biden is just there and does whatever is whispered into his ears. Who knows if he's even signing the bills itself? It could be a situation like Woodrow Wilson after a stroke, where his wife or one of his aides or one of his assistants are signing his signature on whatever bill. Now, of course, there's video footage of him signing some bills, but again, not every bill, not every executive order being signed is going to have a massive media presence. And sometimes, especially this is more of a congressional things, they meet at midnight or 3 a.m. to decide these sort of things, and like these massive budget deals, mind you. But point being is, I think you see this all ties together with the past year that culminated in the trial today, with the stuff in Belarus, the stuff in Eastern Europe, with the stuff in Russia, really the nature of these sort of rapid regime change, or these attempted rapid regime change, and where it really puts us today with Biden. And honestly, from what I noticed, like Republicans, right wingers, obviously are not happy with the direction this country's going in. They're actually pretty pessimistic and probably the most quote unquote black pilled, for lack of a better term, they've been in quite some time. But it seems like beyond just the regular sort of social media type discourse, there's really not that much of a strong backlash to Biden because he is so absentee and because he is so, again, out of the spotlight. Whereas we can all
Yeah.
point to the examples of Trump derangement syndrome, liberals freaking out about Trump and talking about how horrible he is, calling him Nazi, racist, fascist, all these other sort of things. Whereas, like, yeah, you have a lot of Republican disgruntlement with Biden, but you don't see the same sort of visceral backlash. And again, I think that goes back to the cultural differences between what the American left purports to be and what the American right purports to be, whereas they try to be we're the calm, moderate ones, we can fight them back with our principles, with our words, whereas the left is more power driven, has a by any means necessary sort of attitude about all of this. But again, point being is, I mean, there was a lot of outrage under Obama, and you saw that manifest in things like the Tea Party movement and all the other various Republican political movements. But again, I don't think you're seeing that now because I think Republicans realized after this past year, after this past election especially, this is no longer their country. This is no longer the country of the foundational America, so to speak. And you can see that today with some of the backlash about the um, Anglo-Saxon political caucus that they wanted to start Congress to honor America's Anglo-Saxon traditions and how we're rooted in English common law and all that sort of stuff. And the massive backlash to that. But again, just all the events, whether that be the racial tensions, any of that, I think the sort of people who make up the core of the Republican Party realize this isn't your nation anymore if it ever was.
Right, and I would just simply add to that, just to clarify what I think what we're both getting at in terms of like symbolic power, is that essentially part of the American tradition is in itself a simulacrum, and the president is also a simulacrum. But this only makes optics that much more important. So the symbolic is very important. That's why the media and corporate apparatus really has to work overtime and in a way that they would prefer not to. That isn't simply just for the difficulty that it presents, but as we saw under Trump, it would reveal where the power is. And I think unconsciously the whole healing America line that was used for the Biden administration, him not being present, turning off that simulacrum. In fact, indeed, the whole system is an attempt to heal America. I mean, it's not going to do it, obviously, right? The direction of things are going in one way, and they can only go in one way. So, there's just countless examples. I won't bring up January 6th. That's just one, or the Chauvin trial, or whatever, or the politics around those things, rather than those things in and of themselves. So yeah, it is very important, and
and has been for over a quarter of a century, for a good 30, 35 years now, as it's being honed. And we're just seeing a kind of new iteration, right? So we're going to see a lot less of him, as you pointed out. So people aren't as bothered. Yeah, this just makes more things manageable.
Now, moving on to our final leg of the show, covering some Middle Eastern news. There's quite a bit about Iran, but we'll get into Syria first just to get the routine coverage. So, of course, a lot of the fighting in northwestern Syria with the quote unquote rebels, the opposition groups, making quite a comeback, shelling back against the pro Assad forces, the pro government forces. Of course, some civilian casualties thrown in there as these sort of urban warfare situations work. ISIS resurgences in eastern Syria, as is expected. More issues with the Kurds. Turkey is establishing, again, they have their outposts established, and now pro-Turkish groups are also fighting again, and just the regular skirmishes in northeastern Syria as well. So you have all that playing out, and it looks like, while again the world's attention is focused elsewhere, it has just been a very easy time for, well, relatively easy time for Syria to push in and push forward to really put an end to this outpost in Idlib, in the Idlib area. And you had some issues with their oil shipments with the closure of the Suez Canal about a month ago at this point. And you had, of course, Russia and Iran help to supplement that. And, of course, once that was open, Syria did have a short oil shortage there. But you're seeing also, and we'll get into some of the Iran news, Israel harassing Iranian vessels and alleged Israeli clandestine activities within key Iranian facilities. And really, the news on Syria isn't that much this week. I figured I'll just give you a good brief overview of the situation on the ground. But primarily, what I wanted to discuss was Iran, because while you have Iran claiming more clandestine and, if not overt, Israeli attacks and sabotage on their facilities, on their key assets, again, such as nuclear facilities, such as, again, just the vital things you think of, the oil shipping. You also have a quote unquote success from the Biden administration with breakthrough with negotiations with Iran. The U.S. is calling them positive. There's speculation that they may reach a deal soon. Rouhani was speaking positively of his negotiations with the U.S. right now, and Iranian negotiations with the U.S. right now. So, out of all of this, we may see a patchwork recreation of the Iranian nuclear deal from 2015, which will be interesting. And I wonder if Biden will also try to shoehorn this into trying to get into more diplomatic talks with Russia, since of course he proposed talking about climate change and all these other trivial things with Russia when he proposed to them, when he proposed to me with Putin in a neutral third country. So I am wondering, as time goes on, if he'll reach out to the Russians and reach out to Putin saying, well, we want to discuss the Iranian nuclear deal. We want to undo Trump's horrible mistake of getting out of it. Blah, 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 whatever. And I do think it's no coincidence, and again, I'm not a big believer in coincidences, that these Israeli operations are happening at the same time as the U.S. diplomatic breakthroughs. I think they finally found a synthesis of the approach they're going to try, because under Obama, you had Israel frustrated that the U.S. was being too friendly with Iran. Under Trump, you had a coordinated Israeli-American effort in cooperation with countries like Saudi Arabia and other Gulf states to put pressure on Iran. The maximum pressure campaign, threatening strikes, putting down sanctions, seizing their oil tankers, etc. But I think they're now trying, for lack of a better term, a good cop, bad cop approach, whereas you send the U.S. delegation over there, you send the diplomats over there to have friendly times to talk it out and try to salvage the deal, while you have a bunch of clandestine operations done by Israeli intelligence, probably with the support of American intelligence, if not outright involved by American intelligence, of sabotage these facilities and of other key Iranian assets.
Yeah, the Middle East is another area that, of course we cover it every week, but it's also another area where America is receding from. Um, and there's been some speculation. I don't mean to go too off topic, but that America possibly could be gearing for war in Eastern Europe, and that's why they're taking those soldiers out of Afghanistan. But my personal belief is, I doubt it. I don't think so. I think the plan for the Middle East is very similar to the plan for Eastern Europe. America is going to have client states that it's going to work with very closely in terms of intelligence, in terms of let's say observation, reconnaissance, drones, etc. And they're going to do the majority of the fighting. America is no longer capable of the kind of massive uh, deployments that we saw in the 90s and early 2000s. Those days are gone, and I think it's it might be tempting to say that it's tempting to say that, well, it's not really the domestic issues, but I think it is. I think America has never had so many domestic issues and has never been so divided in at least 50 years. And if we recall that time, it was another time where America had to retract. And then, of course, here I'm speaking about Vietnam. Um, Biden's attempts for the JPCOA, they're not gonna succeed. The the sanctions are going to be very difficult to lift. They're, like it's that old William Carlos Williams poem, coming out of coming out of the ocean on the beach. It's very easy to put on a bathing suit, very hard to take off when wet. I'm paraphrasing terribly, but that's the way sanctions are. And there's always going to be a lobby that will stop that from happening. But Biden is still posturing as if the likelihood of a agreement with Iran is almost imminent, given enough time. But that's not going to happen. Iran has, for all intents and purposes, left that behind. It does not consider America a free player. It's been wise to American Jewish lobbies and Israeli lobbies that would, not to mention neocons that would fight tooth and nail in order to stop that. So, yeah, I just wanted to add that. But of
And
course, you have China also. It's becoming. I mean, it just is. It's a huge influence. Saudi Arabia and United Arab Emirates working closely with China, as I mentioned, the Digital Road. There are plans for that entire region to be made over with China's assistance. It's not just going to be Iran, and Iran is dead smack in the middle between Lisbon and Beijing. So it's going to be literally central.
well, as I was saying a few episodes back, the idea of a direct American-Iranian confrontation, even a proxy American-Iranian confrontation, has been put to rest.
Yeah.
Especially with their agreement they reached with China, and I think the fact that the U.S. is trying to salvage some sort of agreement with the Iranians, it shows that for the time being, for the foreseeable future, America, unless you get like a really, really neoconservative president there, I don't know, maybe I can't even think of anyone. I don't know, maybe somebody like Tom Cotton in office, but one of
Mm.
these like really like hardcore anti-Iran Republicans. I can't see a future where we engage with Iran for at least the next decade, and time will tell. And I think even if you get one of those more hardline neoconservatives in there, like somebody who would agree with John Bolton on the issue, to put it in perspective, I don't think you would get.
Yes.
I don't think you get that sort of thing. Even John Bolton admitted that direct confrontation with Iran would be untenable at this point. That was in 2018 when he was Trump's national security advisor. So let that be a lesson to you when it comes to hawkishness towards Iran and the possible American escalation of tensions, etc. But again, I think you make a good point. I think we're seeing this sort of Chinese century rising, if you will, where they have to deal with Iran, but they're also dealing with the Gulf states and Saudi Arabia and even Israel. They're really serving the role China has historically of being just this massive trading power and trading with countries along what was at least once the Silk Road. And you made the point, Iran's that halfway point between Portugal, Lisbon, and Portugal. Is the far western end of Europe and Beijing. And already they're building that one railway from Shanghai to Hamburg, is it? Hamburg, Berlin,
Mm.
one of the major German cities. Point being, and yeah, I think we're seeing the way that's going. I think that's also explains a lot of the Biden administration's policy when it comes to the world stage, where they're taking sort of that retract thing because they realize the situation on the ground. They realize, ironically enough, kind of what Trump said, and are adapting to that. But speaking of Germany, I want to close out with some
Mhm, mhm.
final news on Germany. Now, mainly what I want to talk about is the astroturfing of this Green Party leader saying, "Oh, she could be Germany's next Angela Merkel." Now, we said with we said with the all but completion of Nord Stream 2 that you would see probably the next avenue they attack Nord Stream 2 from will not be sanctions, will not be sabotage, but environmentalism. That was my prediction, at least. And now, Annalena Baerbock, Baerbock is the leader of the German Green Party, and they're astroturfing her. The BBC has this fluff piece on her. All these big mainstream media outlets have the fluff piece on her, talking about how great she is and how she'd be a wonderful, strong woman leader. And again, she's relatively young. She's 40 years old, so hitting on that end, and trying to get like that real youth appeal, that youthful energy back in Germany, especially after Merkel, who really isn't that old, but whose aging has not been kind to her, so to speak. And you could even tell with some of her health problems with the. I believe she was receiving a state visitor from Finland. I think, in fact, the Prime Minister of Finland, and was just shaking during the official state ceremony. And it looked, honestly, I'm no doctor, but it looked like something like Parkinson's was going on there.
Yeah.
And now you're seeing this, and of course, the right wing of Germany, such as their conservative party, the AFD, hasn't really put together a united front. The German right isn't really that strong now. I think one of the main election issues in Germany will be number one, the fate of energy. I think that will put a dent in the Green Party's prospects. I think most Germans are at least content with Nord Stream 2. And number two, I think the lockdowns going on in Germany, I know they announced an extension of their lockdown, is another big point that will be something of debate now, as it's tend to play out across most of the rest of the Western world. Typically, the left wing is for the more stringent lockdowns, right wing's more loose lockdowns, if not getting rid of them entirely. So, I think looking forward to the German elections in September, so about 5 months from now, I think like 5 months from today, the big two issues are going to be energy and lockdowns. And I think energy will probably edge out because, again, lockdowns, they may not be ideal. They may be frustrating. A lot of the population may be fed up with them. But I think getting that cheap oil and gas, especially when it comes to your heating bills, that kind of stuff, is going to resonate with people more. And again, you could see where these things fall. It seems like the German right, and pretty much I think everyone with the German Green Party is pretty much in consensus with Nord Stream 2 and with Germany's current energy policy. Whereas, again, you had this flow in the lockdown. But I had a feeling that there would be an astroturfing of the Green Party, and I expect you to hear
Yeah.
nonstop about this for the foreseeable future. And we're 5 months out, and considering the fact the German election cycle doesn't start until like a month and a half for their election, if even, I, I really can't say how it's going to turn out, but I think Merkel's success in the CDU has a decent chance. I think he can't be horrible, and maybe he'll have to concede a bit to the right and build a coalition government on that end, and return the CDU to a more proper center-right party rather than this centrist or center-left way it's been governing since. And again, you've seen a lot of backlash in Germany. Now, it hasn't necessarily been electorally, but it's been through the move of government concessions, whereas, yeah, Germany, who was bringing in waves upon waves of migrants in 2015, 2016, had to cut back. They had to accept Nord Stream 2. They had to do all these things that you would have expected from a right wing or populist party, But that's because, again, the political pressure is mounting. Merkel's in a lame duck term. She doesn't really care that much about the public backlash for a position she's only going to hold for a few more years at this point, a few more months. And really, I think Germany is one of the big places to keep your eye on over the next few months, over the next 5, 6 months.
Yes, it's going to be interesting how things go. Yeah, you were right. Your prediction for for Nord Stream 2 and for the way the Green Party would stand against it. Blinken, I think today or yesterday, said that America will keep tabs. He didn't say tabs, but that America would look at countries who are not doing enough to reduce coal, who are selling coal, who are using coal. It might surprise people, but actually the greatest user of coal in the EU is Germany. So that's going to, have pressure. And ironically, the greatest purchaser of coal in Ukraine is Ukraine, and they're buying it from the Donbass section of Ukraine. So, yeah. Well, I mean, Nord Stream 1 took about 2 years to complete. Back over, what is it? Over 10, 12 years ago. This one is taking quite a bit longer. It'll be interesting to see if the new chancellor is going to nix it or not. So far, I'm not seeing any great success coming from the U.S. And there's no news is essentially good news, because it generally means that they're constructing it. And if you hear news, it's either various attempts by state actors, military actors, and commercial ships trying to prevent it or to get in the way, but with plausible deniability. Yeah, so they're like, if you're not hearing about it, it's probably being constructed, and I do think there is actually literally a chance it will be completed before the elections. And even after the election, they won't, there's certain things in place. It will take at least a week or two even after that. So it won't be just automatically scrapped on election night.
Yeah, I think going back to what we've been saying for the past several months about Nord Stream is that even if they wanted to dismantle this, even if they wanted to get rid of it, it's not going to happen. It's too far gone, and it's going to take an act of complete diplomatic break with Russia or some sort of crisis that may be attributed to, some may say, sabotage, to end this pipeline, to end this energy deal, along with all the other countries that are in it. But really, I think that to bring it all around, to bring the past few years in perspective, Donald Trump is responsible for Nord Stream 2. Now, he signaled against it. He tried to sell his LNG oil and gas to Europe. He tried to do all of that. But I think had Hillary Clinton been in office,
Mm-hmm.
had she won the election, Germany would have capitulated in probably the day after the election. They probably would have cut off these energy ties with Russia the day after the election. And that's also going into France. Somebody like Macron would just be yet another subservient neoliberal sort of leader, rather than one who is admittedly neoliberal, at least has initiative, and at least takes actions to act on their own and treat their country as a semi-independent actor, we'll say. But at the end of the day, I do think when it comes to people talking about the effects of Trump, the effects of the past 4 years, and the chaos of all that, one of the biggest things that will be overlooked, mainly because it's a foreign issue and a lot of people overlook those when they're looking at the scope of their own nation, will be the completion of Nord Stream 2, because, like I said, I don't think it could have been possible under another Clinton administration. I don't think it could have been possible if any other Republican came into office, barring a few examples, or most other Democrats, barring a few examples. I think even Bernie Sanders would, Bernie Sanders, they could have really played up the environmental angle. Oh, we have to help our allies reach clean energy with solar and wind, that sort of nonsense. But
Mhm.
which I think is exactly what they're going to do now. I think this is exactly what they're going to do now to try to maybe not stop this, but to prevent any further cooperation between Germany or any other European country when it comes to Russian oil and gas. And again, I could see them propping up the Green Party to stifle any further efforts, or Green parties or pro-environmentalist movements in other countries to stifle efforts. You may think, again, think Hungary. That'd be a double whammy. They want to get rid of Orban for other reasons, but they're also not a fan of the Turk Stream or any of these other sort of pipelines. But again, I think one of the main things going forward is it's going to give a whole new meaning to color revolution, that you're going to see the American State Department support green parties and environmentalist movements, mainly
Yeah.
across Europe, in the next 4 to 8 years. I imagine somebody like Kamala, especially, and seeing the kind of people she would bring to the administration, if slash when she succeeds Biden, will take it to a whole new level.
Right, and and this dreams goes a long way for this pipeline. It begins in '97. There's changing of the name and the company, but there was a Finnish company and a German company that were also working with the Russian company. North Transgas Cooperation was the German company Ruhrgas. Anyhow, so like I think after the fall of the Soviet Union, there was an idea of how uh, Europe could be reimagined, without hostilities. But even at that time, even in the late '90s, when it was just plans, and then by 2005, 2006, laying down of pipes, and then by 2010, it was, really starting to get going. Uh, even then, America had to have it its way, and that's when it proposed and enacted new sanctions on those companies to dissuade them. Again, it was completed, and I think the fear for America, of course, isn't that that Russia is going to steamroll into Berlin again. I think it's a question of influence, and it also affects Britain, and it's Britain's influence on Europe would also be um, constrained. And you can see with the developments in the Black Sea, Biden says, we're going to do something about Putin. Then he decides to take his two battleships that were supposed to go into the Black Sea. He turns them around, but Britain is still going to go in, as if Britain is going to achieve anything.
Mind, we all know Boris Johnson's just trying to accomplish his blood feud. I mean, of course, the man is of Turkish, Circassian, and Jewish heritage, so you can only wonder what his opinion might be on the Russians. So, but yeah, with that being said, I mean, you do make a point. It's going to disempower the American role in Europe. It's going to disempower the British role in Europe, which I think, especially with the slipping British power in general, that's going to be something that is a lot more evident than the diminishing American role. But I think with the completion of Nord Stream 2, and depending on how this recent German election goes and how the next few years in Europe go, the worst fear of the Anglosphere, the worst fear of the Atlanticists, may come true when it comes to Russian German cooperation or Russian cooperation with continental Europe in general. And this will be a big blow because there's not really anything they can do to stop this process short of, again, if you listen to US Stratcom, maybe escalate into a nuclear war because wars are non-linear nowadays, but they can throw sanctions all they want. They can sanction Russia and Germany at the same time. They can sanction all these different companies, but at the end of the day, I think at some point, 20, 30 years ago, the Atlanticists, the Anglosphere, failed to act, whether that was a further crackdown and final defeat of Russia or an acceptance of them as a partner on equal footing, not necessarily a friend and ally, but somebody they can tolerate and give their own sphere of influence. We discussed this back with, I think this was about 3 episodes ago, when, again, Trump made that offer to Putin about 15 years later than the U.S. should have. An offer that Bush should have made in 2003, for example. But again, they squandered both those opportunities to really kick Russia while it's down and completely do away with the issue, or they missed the opportunity to turn over a new leaf and pursue a semi-productive relationship with them. And really, I'm not saying Russia's going to be the next world superpower or anything, but they've created a unified block of power on the European landmass, on the, some may say, Eurasian landmass for that matter, when you account for China's role in all of this too, and China's, again, massive railroad and their Belt and Road Initiative, all that kind of stuff. And really, I can't pinpoint an exact moment. Maybe the exact moment is Trump taking the oath of office, where it really went downhill and where there was no going back. I would say it's probably a bit sooner. I think 2015 is when a lot of the mistakes the neoliberal empire made, a lot of the irreparable damage was done that really got us to this point. If I had to pinpoint an exact year, I'd probably say 2015.
Yeah, that does seem to be the turning point. There were hints of it in 2008. I mean, I think America and Britain and the West have always recognized what value Russia is to Europe, but it's always been what value it is to them from a unipolar perspective, right? What they want is a Russia that is divided, is equal. Like literally, when they project that Russia is just a gas station, what they're saying is why can't Russia just be a gas station? I need a friggin' gas station here, right? That is what they're saying, and I think at this point they've for the most part, Britain and America have given up. Their ultimate aim is to completely cut Russia off from Europe. Like for them, their actions are, they're very desperate. Like they seem to me almost as desperate as those in the Middle East. So, yeah, uh, and all of this because Russia isn't from the beginning what it is that they want Russia to be. It is powerful. It has achieved great things. It is a great power. And it has been a great power for well over 300 years in that area. And through all its tragedies, through all its seeming destructions, it always comes back. So it's never turned into as far as the 20th and 21st century incarnation into the gas station that they had always wanted.
Not even under Yeltsin, and that's saying a lot because of how
Yeah,
conciliatory he was, for lack of a better
you
term.
think that,
Perhaps,
right?
perhaps subservient is a better term. Not even then. Maybe it was a matter of time because he wasn't in office long enough, and things started to go uh, south too bad, or things started to deteriorate at a much too rapid rate. But not even they could plunder Russia to the extent that they wanted to under Yeltsin. They wanted a
Yeah,
complete capitulation, and they had practically control of what I mean. All the oligarchs, they had ties to the West or to Israel, being part of a certain tribe. Because after Putin came to power, the ones that, of course, did not submit to him either went to places like Paris, Madrid, London. London's a big one. Tel Aviv, New York. Again, what do these cities have in common? I'll let you be the judge of that, but
mm,
with all that being said, is at the end of the day, it is the idea that they cannot accept Russia as an equal. I think it goes back down to the fact that there is fundamentally too much of a civilizational divide between the two, and it's an interesting situation because, of course, there's a massive civilizational divide between the West and China, but perhaps that massive distance makes it more tolerable. But with how it's a divide, but a very similar culture, so to speak, where is there I wouldn't know how to describe. Perhaps it's so similar to the point where a Russian civilization, so to speak, I'm not saying it would, but could influence, if not overtake, a Western civilization. Whereas with China, it'd take a lot of work. It would take a massive overhaul. It would take cataclysmic events for Western culture to overtake China or Chinese culture to overtake the West. Whereas with the West and Russia, you could tip the scales in a certain way where one could take over the other or wield great influence over the other with not that much work. Russia's always been part of that community of European nations, always been part of that great power. I mean, look at how much Russian German intermarriage there was among their elites back in the days of the monarchy. I mean, I think by the time of the fall of the Russian Empire, of course, the royal family, the aristocratic class, they were all either partially or fully of at least German heritage. Now, how they culturally were, it went back and forth. Some of them were thoroughly Russian, some of them were more Western, some of them were more German. But point being is, it's that point where, again, there's only room for one of them fundamentally at the end of the day. I mean,
Mhm.
perhaps there could have been an era of cooperation, perhaps there could have been an era of good feelings, but that ship has sailed to the point where there's only room for one of them. Are you going to have a Russian influenced civilization, or at this point, with the current controllers of Western civilization, an Anglo Jewish influenced civilization? I think it ultimately comes down to that, and I think both have their great advantages. I think, again, the sea power of the Western world, the economic power, has that, but they're also a more aged, decaying civilization. Whereas the Russians, the Slavic people, they've had their trials, they've had their tribulations. They're definitely not in a good position right now, but I think they have a lot more life force left in them, so to speak. I think they have a lot more they can still accomplish. I think they have that so-called youthful energy that could be what tips the scales. And of course, Russia is vast with natural resources, etc. They're again also viewed as part of that European community nations by several Europeans, maybe not all of them, maybe not even a majority of them, but I would say by a certain segment, and that might just be enough. You see in places like Hungary, you see in places again even in Western Europe, Germany, Italy, etc., even France, where they want at least that normalization or cessation of hostilities with Russia. So, point being is, at the end of the day, while different civilizations can coexist in more or less of fashion, I think we've gotten to the point with the amount of tensions and with the really similarities between the two that it's got to be one or the other at the end of the day. Now, how that will play out in the long run, really, it's probably going to happen long after most of us are dead, if we're being honest, unless there's some very
Oh yeah.
cataclysmic events within the next 50 years. But that being said, it's pointless to speculate on what's, 2, 3 centuries down the road, if we even have 2, 3 centuries down the road.
Yeah, I mean that would be my forecast as well. Also, like one of the reasons why these things take so long is the way one civilization, which isn't always fully aware of itself, is sitting next to an older and more developed and advanced civilization. And so there's this um, linguistic overcoding, there is an aesthetic overcoding, an architectural overcoding.
I suppose the
And
very shallow example would be Greece and Rome.
well, yeah, to a degree, but
As
I
I
would go
said, very
further.
shallow
I,
example.
okay, yeah, I mean, to a degree, yes. I mean, Rome literally used the Corinthian style helmet, but they made it almost like an ornament. They like the Triarii had helmets. These were like their elite spearmen. Um, the Corinthian helmet was actually smaller, so you could never actually pull it down. It was almost like they only saw the vases that depicted the classic Spartan Corinthian helmet. Be that as it may, their two types weren't as different as possible. I would say a type, I would say an example that I think demonstrates what we're getting at better would be the Corinthians. The Carthaginians. Here's the people that moved from the Levant, from what's modern day Lebanon. They settle into, on North Africa and Spain. But, in terms of like their clothes, their architecture, uh, the kind of shields that their armies use, their helmets, the whole kit, um, is the classic Greek hoplite style, right? So their languages are completely different. Their religions are different. They're both polytheistic, but that's where the similarities stop. And so you have this culture that distinguishes itself, but on the surface, it's been overcoated by the Greek and later by the Greco-Roman ideals, by their civilizational code language. And if you look at Russia, Russia is overcoated with Western types, right? That's particularly after Peter the Great, right? They're overcoated with that. So if you go to St. Petersburg, you're going to see a lot of buildings that look like that late Renaissance style from the time of the Age of Enlightenment, right? That's now Russia's always kept their original architecture, the architecture that is them and no one else, intact. They will continue to do that. And my guess is when it appears that their culture can flourish again, can find a way that it communicates with itself and asserts itself, and it has, the vision, the same kind of manifest destiny that the West had, right? That's when it will happen. But it will first have to resolve and flush out these this Western overcoating for it to be a proper self-identified civilization.
Well,
You
we're already
hear
seeing
that,
at least the, I would say, for lack of a better term, preview of it. Now, I don't think it's set a trend yet, but that military cathedral that they built, I think, shows
yeah,
they're at least slowly but surely going that direction. Like I said, I think at the most generous take, it's going to be half a century before we see that, and the most realistic take, most of us will be dead and gone by the time they actually get to that point.
right, right, and really, like, Russia, like, I mean, even during the time of the Russian Revolution, 80% of the businesses were owned by non-Russians. The king and queens were, except for, you know, I mean, they were Russian and Slavic to a point, and then they're Germanic or they're Anglo-Germanic in terms of their relations with the British family, right? In a sense, you could argue, like, from an anthropological point of view, from a philosophy of history point of view, that this is actually very recent. Like, their pre-culture extends very far back. Okay, but their culture period, like the real rising of that, really kind of begins with Dostoevsky, to a lesser extent with Pushkin, uh, and I would say, to sort of be more radical about it, I would say with the filmmaker Tarkovsky. So they're still in a fairly early stage of this development with a prior long childhood, if I may, right? And so yeah, that's, I mean, but again, we don't know. We don't know what will happen. The Aztecs had a civilization that was cut short. We don't know how these things will go. It's like they go in a certain direction, but it doesn't mean that external forces can't stop that.
Yeah, and like I said, there's so many unknown factors. There's so many cataclysmic events. I don't know. Maybe the U.S. Stratcom tweet wasn't all hot air, and well, maybe it was, very hot air with the way things are going. You get the joke. But point being
Mm-hmm.
is, you could get any number of apocalyptic events that, I mean, if not a real apocalypse itself, all of us, all of us dead, whatever. But point being is, there's so many unknown factors that cannot be accounted for. But if general trends continue, I think that's what I think we're looking at again. Russia coming more into its own, and at the end of the day, it's got to be one or the other. With how similar the two are, how intertwined the two are, the fact that there's really only room for one of them.
Yeah, yeah. No, I think it's a great point. Scary point, but I think it's an honest point.
Well, I just hope I don't live long enough to see the culmination of that, and hopefully that's a few centuries down the road. I hope my descendants, I hope all our descendants, best of luck to you if the internet still exists and you can listen to you can listen to our very prophetic predictions. Really speak ourselves up. I don't know. Maybe you're sitting in 2221 AD and this is really resonating with you. In that case, welcome. I'm glad you found us. It's a real time capsule. You should go and listen to our other episodes. And that's for all you new viewers. I don't care whether you're listening in 2021 or 2221. It's for you. enjoy. But I think that covers all we have for this week, unless you have anything else.
No, that's about it for me.
Well, this has been another episode of the War Report. We went a little longer than I was expecting today. I thought we would struggle to get over an hour, but apparently not. This is about to join the hour and a half club if I keep rambling for another few seconds here. And we broke the hour and a half mark, which means I can feel comfortable ending this. So we'll see you guys next time, and goodbye.
Take care.